Bam. Welcome to the 5, 8 and a half, your midweek break. I'm Nadine Smith, along with our special guest host, Greg Olear. You know the drill, 5 stories, 8 minutes. This is your midweek chance to refuel, where we slow things down just enough to sip, to reflect, and remember you are not alone. Hey, Greg.
How are you? How's it going?
I am doing well. Fancy meeting you here on a Wednesday.
I know. I feel like I've time warped somehow because I'm on. It's the wrong night, but what are you going to do?
Every night is the right night for Greg Olear.
It's always.
I said you were not alone, but I was very nearly alone because our intrepid Lisa Graves is out on the road, and she has run into internet difficulties, and so. But you'll get to see her because she's coming on tonight as our guest. So
right, exactly.
Yeah, but how have you been?
She's going to be like, it's going to be like a robotic her because it's going to be. So it'll be interesting.
It's like Mad Libs. It's Mad Libs, and then we'll fill in what we think she might have said.
That's a fun way to do it. That's a fun way to do it.
You just say between the sheets. At least that's what I learned in Bible study. Bible camp. You say that. Will say this. I went to a movie today, and I don't want to talk about this for long, but I went to see. Was it the Thunderbolts? It is this new Marvel film.
Oh, that thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's called Thunderbolts. Anyway, well, I thought it was just going to be a Marvel movie, but this was a therapy session because it was a study of nihilism, like what it means to look into the void, and realize the void is looking back at you and how you traverse it. And, we're used to some pretty on the nose kind of resistance movies, but this one was kind of we need each other, at the end of the day. You're born alone, you'll die alone, but in between, we need each other. So that is an unexpected Marvel Universe pitch for a movie whose name I'm not sure is Thunderbolts, but I think it is.
It's not Thundercats. It's not
Thundercats.
It's something like that. I wouldn't expect the nihilistic lessons to be taught in such a way through Marvel, but I saw the Mountainhead movie. Did you see that yet? You know what that is?
The Mountainhead movie?
It's just called Mountainhead. It's like these four uber rich tech guys are on a mountain.
I've seen the trailer.
Yeah. And it's like Mountainhead, like Fountainhead, which they address right away. And the one guy's like, "Who's your decorator?" Anne Bland, and it's like her. And it's not a great movie, but there's some pretty funny things in it. Speaking of nihilism and philosophy and philosophers that people misunderstand, it's just.
Well, that's a companion piece to Thunderbolts, or whatever that movie is I just saw. Well, speaking of the void and looking into it, let's say we start in Los Angeles.
And we can start in Los Angeles. Wait, do you do the timer or does she do the timer? I forget who does the timer.
You know what? Lisa allegedly does the timer. We
what we can do?
Our timer discipline has been
I mean, everybody's timer's discipline is like that. It'd be funny is if she did the timer, and if we were over the timer, she just popped in and just was the timer. I've always wanted to do that.
She'll do
it. She's gonna do it. She's gonna do it. I've always wanted to do that. Like they do that, on PTI. I think when it's time, they cut back. The guy pops in.
We're making dreams come true tonight, everybody.
It's really it's good. It's good.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yeah, these are. I think there's a reason that I don't know, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and all, like that nihilism is reared its head in Hollywood, because I think we're all watching what's unfolding in Los Angeles right now with the same aching dread, massive ICE raids that are leaving children sobbing on the sidewalk. The Trump administration has ordered 3,000 arrests per day. And I think this is the number that Stephen Miller pulled out of his, pulled out. And they're not just targeting people with criminal records, obviously. They're targeting dishwashers and parents and caregivers, people with no people showing up for their immigration court dates. And, this is reaching a place where people are standing up for their neighbors in addition to standing up on these principles. And it is creating the showdown that perhaps Trump has wanted all along. And it seems as though they're going to make Los Angeles the first of what will be the blueprint for every blue city.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that way. On the other hand, I mean, there's not that many protesters, and there's an awful lot of National Guardsmen and women there. They're just there. Like, it's like the orgy joke. Like, what if we have a riot and nobody came? Like, they have to have at least a couple people. Like, it would be ironic if they had to only arrest their own paid protesters. They're paid double agent, what do you call it? Provocateurs, agent provocateur, or whatever. Because that's the only people who even showed up at this thing. But I don't know. It just seems silly to it seems that the level of military force right now in the form of the National Guard in Los Angeles, the ratio of that to the need of that many people being there is on par with the ratio of tanks in DC versus the number that are actually needed there. I think it's exactly even,
Well, I mean, I think that's part of it, though. I'm seeing a lot of people who are just posting, this is what Los Angeles looks like. The images that apparently are flooding the right-wing MAGA internet are of absolute, desolation and nonstop, replaying of a brick being thrown. And, people are dancing in the street. They're protesting. And I think this moment, coupled with what we know AI is capable of, is a pretty fraught mixture. But I think there's also the danger that we saw this with George Floyd protests, where the response to peaceful protests were intended to provoke people into responding in kind. But when they started shooting rubber bullets at, sort of middle-class suburban porches, telling people to get back inside their house, the thing shifted kind of dramatically because it was no longer contained in the areas where middle-class people couldn't see it. And so on the one hand, it's disturbing to see that people still, the majority of Americans, are staying with Trump on immigration. But I think we can be at this tipping point where what happens in Los Angeles right now can be the moment where the tide begins to turn. And that's not a given, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. And even when I'm seeing more and more veterans online calling out to active duty military to not follow illegal orders, to remember what their oath is. And when you see National Guard who've been federalized sleeping on concrete floors because they didn't bother to send them with any supplies, didn't send them with, made any provisions for them. We shall see. We shall see how this all plays out.
Well, Hegseth was busy. He wasn't busy. He was just drinking. And I guess his wife didn't figure out how to do that yet. My theory is that his wife is actually doing the entire job of running the Defense Department, and he's just on hand to drink, be belligerent, and use up all the hair supplies, hair products.
What? I heard somebody call him not Hegseth, but Keg's breath, and I thought, man, that was sitting right there the whole time. I felt so foolish that I hadn't thought of that.
I find that pejorative to kegs, though. I have a soft spot for kegs. I feel like it's too much. But what is your feeling about the LA stuff? Like, do you think it's, you said you feel like it's coming to a point, but how do you think it might turn around? What do you think is going to happen? Or what do you hope happens?
Yeah. What I hope happens is that people continue to take to the street. But, like there was footage of a woman who was just trying to get to her apartment. She's walking by herself. She's talking to them, and whoever was captioning this said this was a woman trying to go home, and she had to walk along the edge of this militarized perimeter, and she's telling them, "That's my house." And there's one guy who just takes aim at her, shoots her in the stomach with a rubber bullet. No provocation. And I think those are the kinds of incidents that are going to turn people, away from what's happening. And, you know, unfortunately, I think when it begins to impede the lives of, sort of white middle class America, that's when people start going, "Oh, it's not just happening to others, it's happening to people who look like me and live like me." No, I think that's part of what may unfold.
I hope so. Although it's sad that it has to, it takes that level of things to get anybody to move. But I want to say also just a shout out to everybody who is out protesting, because I feel like it's really, really important when these Nazis show up, this Gestapo shows up and they start, with their masks and their lack of papers and everything else. It's incumbent upon people living in those communities to not let them in. And if there's enough people showing out and, basically forming a wall between the ICE agents and the people that are coming to arrest, they will leave, because like Trump, like their, Obenfuhrer there, they're cowards. If they weren't cowards, they would not wear masks, and they would, actually have documentation that shows who they are. And they wouldn't come in with the guns blazing and all this stuff, because it's not, why does it require that at all? You can't arrest or go talk to a woman who's 8 months pregnant. You need a gun and 6 people to do that. It's just
Well,
ridiculous.
the other thing that tells you that they're cowards is that bling, bling, there's our timer. Thank you, Lisa. I like this. I like this.
This is good stuff.
All
This
right.
is
Well,
good
I'll just
content.
that's perfect. But I also think that part of this is that if it tells you that they're cowards because they're afraid of Stephen Miller, but also that we're beginning to see people buy ICE paraphernalia on Amazon or Etsy, ICE jackets and badges, and they are, rousting people. They're robbing people. They're shaking people down, and that's what happens when you create a world in which government officials behave like criminals. It allows criminals to behave like law enforcement. All right.
Yeah. Which is part of what they're trying to do. I think they're trying to create chaos and fear and make people afraid to go outside, make people in the suburbs who never go to the cities afraid to go to the cities to verify what's actually happening. New York is a hell. Like Newsom has been, every time one of these red state idiots talks about the crime in LA, he just responds with, the homicide rate is literally twice in Alabama or Mississippi or Arkansas or wherever than it is in California. So fuck off. Which is sad, but it's true. And maybe address that. I don't know. Let California do its own thing.
Yeah. Well, speaking of cowards and insecure men, let's talk about Trump's parade of insecurity. He's calling it a Flag Day celebration, but it is, without a doubt, cosplaying, his Stalin cosplay with tanks rolling down the capital city, 7 million pounds of tanks, fighter jets flying overhead, 18 miles of fencing, all of it timed for his 79th, is it 79th birthday? What birthday is it?
79. He's only 79 somehow, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not a celebration of the Army's, the anniversary of the Army. It is a giant taxpayer-funded, even Rand Paul, has criticized this as just the kind of thing that we associate with dictators. I mean, he's definitely leaning into it. Rand Paul called it an embarrassing display of authoritarian narcissism, and
That's
he knows
pretty good.
about authoritarian narcissism. So
he does. He does. I just, I still, JFK had Marilyn Monroe like popping out of the cake and singing to him, and Trump has to have this. It's really sad. I mean, really, when you think about it, all this stuff to make them feel manly, and you got to have 17 all these tanks that are going to rip up the. It'd be funny though if they got lost on the street in DC, which is not hard to do. I mean, if you really don't know your way around, I don't think these tanks have ever really been there before.
Yeah, this is a little bit of an aside, but growing up, especially as a Black kid in the South, you would learn these. If there was a question about a Black figure in history, it was almost always going to be Martin Luther King, or Peanuts. Who am I thinking of?
George Washington Carver.
George Washington Carver. And the third fact was that the traffic system in Washington, D.C. was laid out by a Black man, which I was very, very, very proud of right up until I went to D.C.
No, but first of all, it's Banneker, and
Banneker.
L'Enfant started to do it and then left, and he had memorized all of the designs and then improved upon them. But the reason why the streets in DC are like that is so a foreign army can't just parade down the street. Like, DC is literally set up so you cannot have a military parade in it.
See, now Benjamin Banneker redeemed in this moment. Come on.
Redeemed. He's like, wah, wah. It's
he anticipated Trump and completely made a system difficult for him to indulge himself in this narcissistic, fantasy.
Do we know, is Trump going to be like outside? Is he going to be like in the parade? Is he going to be like in Animal House where he's just sitting in a thing and they're parading by?
I can only imagine that he is going to be standing watching them or sitting watching them roll by. What would Stalin do? Right?
Did Stalin I don't know. Did Stalin bother with this shit? I don't know.
Or maybe Lenin. Yes. No, they love this stuff. They love this flexing.
Yeah.
Speaking of flexing, I think at the same time that this is happening, there's also a push for protests all across the country. And I believe the Pope is planning his first mass in the US to conflict with Trump's display of cadet bone spurs. So there is pushback, and I do think that the average American, first of all, these kinds of parades are deathly boring. They're horribly boring to watch. And I think if you're not required to show up in formation, who wants to just watch tank after tank roll by? But they are creating a counterpoint for protest, and I think people are taking advantage of it. And I think you may be right that trying to pull this off in DC may come back to bite him in his substantial backside.
I just wonder if people are going to, I know people are going to show up to protest, which they should. People should just figure out where the tanks are going and just be there. That seems like the most obvious thing to do. Just disrupt the parade, right? The tank's not going to run over anybody in the United States.
We're going to have our own Tiananmen Square, aren't we? We're going to have our own Tiananmen Square moment.
But are like MAGA going to come watch this shit? I mean, is that really going to happen? Are people anticipating this? And where are they going to park, and how are they going to get around? Because all those roads are closed, and it seems like just so dumb. I mean, I know that military guys are planning it, and they presumably are good at logistics and stuff like that. So we'll see. But I don't know. It just seems like a terrible idea. Usually when tanks are rolling through things, they're not like, got to be careful not to hit the mailbox over there or whatever. They just plow through. It's not that important.
Okay, now you've inspired me. I think that the protest should just be the sad trombone sound over and over and over again. Right? And right next to wherever the press is, just have that playing the whole time.
Oh, there's no protests in DC. Okay. I guess that's wise, I suppose. I don't know. I feel like people should just be in the path, but I don't know. I'm not good at this stuff. I'm not good at this stuff. Nobody should listen to me about these things. I'm good at writing in my office. I'm not good at protesting. So
I'm going to take that as a segue, because you writing in your office has sort of inspired our segment 3, because in addition to being pitch hitting for Lisa tonight and hosting the 5/8 and
Sorry, that was delayed.
that was perfect. Well, get ready, Lisa, because you're in for real this time.
I had circus music keyed up, but I couldn't miss my signal from you to play the sad trombone music after the drum segment.
You have arrived.
I might have to go out on circus music, though.
You have arrived just in time, because now we're getting to the heart of the matter. We're getting down to the nitty gritty. I was just saying, Greg, obviously, in addition to being the co-host of the 5/8, is the author of the newsletter Prevail, and your column your newsletter this weekend was fantastic, because as we talk about what's happening in California, what's happening in Los Angeles, this display of military might by Trump, it has raised the specter of what it means to have U.S. military brought into a position to point their weapons at American citizens. And so and Lisa, I think this is the perfect intersection, because we need to talk about the history of it, and we need to talk about what the law tells us right now, and then what we think will happen with an administration that does not care about history or the law. So, Greg, why don't you set the table? Because if anyone hasn't read it, and I know they're going to drop a link in the chat, but if you haven't read it, bookmark it, read it as soon as this episode is over, because it is chock full. There's something for everyone, including Hamilton fans who've been enjoying the resurgence of Aaron Burr songs, because you bring some pretty cool stuff to the surface here.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so I was, we know about Posse Comitatus, which sounds like something somebody made up, but is apparently a real thing. Lisa will get to that, but that just means that the military can't do law enforcement basically on U.S. soil. They're not allowed to do that. And the only way that can be suspended is when they invoke the Insurrection Act. And I thought, okay, well, how did the Insurrection Act of 1807 start? Like, what was the context around the formation of the Insurrection Act of 1807? And it turns out that Aaron Burr is responsible, because I did not realize that he was the sitting vice president when he killed Hamilton, by the way, in the duel. I thought it was after. Like, can you imagine if that happened now? It would be like the vice president shooting his friend in the face on a hunting trip or something. It would be, oh wait, never mind. I guess it isn't that crazy after all. So Burr, that happens. Nobody indicts him. Everything goes away. He goes to South Carolina. He goes back to DC and just finishes out his term like everything's fine. Oh yeah, Hamilton was, we don't need him around anyway. But then when his term is over, he doesn't run for re-election. Jefferson doesn't want him, so he wanders off into the West. And at this time in the history of the United States, Louisiana Purchase has just happened. So we have all this land that people live there, but Americans don't live there yet. We haven't conquered it yet, and there's a lot of space and opportunity, and there's a lot of states that we now know that have not formed yet, didn't exist, and that was called the Old Southwest Territory. So Burr goes into the Old Southwest Territory and hooks up with this plantation owner dude whose name is, I forget, some crazy name. It's in the piece, and it sounds like a Dr. Seuss name, and the guy Wilkinson, who's the a commander in the U.S. Army and the governor of Louisiana. And the three of them together allegedly are conspiring to start and establish their own country somewhere in this territory, actually where northern Louisiana and southern Arkansas collide. So the center of the universe, right? But that the plan sort of falls apart eventually, and nothing happens, and he winds up getting indicted and acquitted for treason. But the Insurrection Act went into being on the last day of the 9th Congress, because they thought this guy was going to have his own country, a rival country, right across the Mississippi. And to make it worse, slavery would be illegal there. So the slaves could just go there And then what would the South do? It would be catastrophic. We can't have that. So Jefferson, they do the thing and they pass this act. Because again, it's a sitting vice president or an ex-vice president, an army commander, and a guy with, basically an oligarch of the time, and open land that they could control. Now, if you contrast that with like 50 people in a Home Depot parking lot, I'm just saying it's not remotely the same thing. It's not the same thing at all. And the fact that it took this much preamble to even explain it, makes it pretty clear that it's not the same thing. So for Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act because of nothing happening in LA that doesn't, normally happen in us, so it's just madness. There is no historical precedent for something that's ridiculous. Even when Jefferson used it in 2008, some traders up in Lake Champlain didn't want to pay the tariff. Got to pay the tariff. At least they were breaking the law. These people are in Los Angeles are not breaking the law. You're allowed to be in a Home Depot parking lot. You're allowed to wave a sign up that says "fuck ICE" or whatever. I don't know. So that's the background. But Lisa, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. This is the way it's being invoked. This insurrection notion in this instance is so counter-historical, so ridiculous. And, I don't know when troops have ever been sent in to deal with dancing protests. It's quite extraordinary what we're seeing unfold. Of course, Trump is itching for this dispute to try to escalate and rationalize his extremism. But, the irony just doesn't even come close to being the right description. Like, you have the president that unleashed an insurrection on the United States, who basically attempted a coup to overturn the 2020 election, who called the people who attacked the Capitol Police with weapons, including flagpoles and, other
zip ties.
Zip tie, that they were heroes, calling, people who were actually engaged in insurrection, who he pardoned, hundreds of people he pardoned who had been convicted, either based on their plea agreements or based on trials, which they lost, to pardon them as one of his very first acts as president, and then to dare to assert that, a protest in Los Angeles is somehow an insurrection warranting calling, moving troops off a Navy ship, calling in the Marines, ordering the National Guard to intervene. Overkill doesn't begin to describe it. It's outrageous and offensive to the notion of law and justice. It's really an outrageous act. And it's also the case that it turns out, like, this whole Trump experiment of awfulness over these past several years has just revealed the numerous weaknesses in our law. One of my friends has described the Constitution and some of these laws as someone driving a horse and buggy on I-95. Like, we have these laws that were written with, feathers, with ink in a feather inkwell for the Insurrection Act, that now are somehow supposed to protect us from this lawless man, this man who has tried to shake off any law that has ever applied to him, any lawsuit that's ever been against him, any loss that he's ever had before the courts. And we're trying to use this, it's almost like a net made of, I'm going to date myself. You remember when you used to have pop cans that had the little pop tabs? It's almost like we have this little net made of like the little pop can tabs all strung together, and we're trying to hold him
like chainmail
with it as if that's the law. But in pop can aluminum form,
pop can
like
aluminum,
that frail.
yeah.
You're talking about the part used to kill turtles, right? The part that if you throw the ocean, it'll kill turtles.
Those bad actors. Yeah. Okay. But when you look at the law more closely, like your story, Greg, of the origin, the history of the Insurrection Act and Posse Comitatus is really quite, revealing. You have laws that were, basically enacted at the time and enforced to protect slavery, basically. Both the Insurrection Act and Posse Comitatus. Posse Comitatus was imposed to try to help the the Confederates in their reconstruction of the South segregation, of Jim Crow segregation in the South. But in general, it has been invoked as a precautionary measure to prevent the troops from being deployed for domestic law enforcement. However, after that immunity decision last year, that counter-constitutional, unprecedented edict from John Roberts of the Supreme Court, you have a law that now, when you read it, you sort of just can't believe what it says. So I was going to read it because there are very few statutes that are this short. Posse Comitatus Act says, whoever, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress, willfully uses any part of the Army or Air Force as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for not more than 2 years or both. So let's just think about it. There's another part that talks about the payment of the troops, that they can't be paid if they're engaged in this activity. But now we have a Supreme Court that has said, you know who can't be fined or imprisoned under criminal law? Donald J. Trump. So you have a law that's supposed to constrain a president or anyone from ordering the troops to be engaged in law enforcement. And the penalty is that you will be guilty of a crime, which this court has said Trump cannot commit when engaged in his official acts. So that's a problem. And then in theory, the troops that pursue these orders that are, in my view, unlawful as a moral matter, but not unlawful as in illegal or criminal under John Roberts' abominable ruling with his fellow Republican appointees in that immunity disaster. But the troops are being paid sort of anyway. And meanwhile, Trump has asserted that he can sort of pay anyone he wants and not pay anyone he wants, fire anyone he wants, or keep who he wants. So we're in this real lawlessness. And then you have the overlay of the Insurrection Act, which, as you note, Greg, was passed, more than 200 years ago, and which, in its first instance, has a heavy constraint on the president to not, send the guard in or the troops in unless there's an insurrection. In essence, if the governor invites the president. But then there are two other provisions that don't require necessarily that the governor invite the president, but that say that if this condition exists, if there's an insurrection. And that goes back to the beginning point, which is this is not an insurrection. This is a routine act of dissent. This is the type of conduct that is, fully consistent with the First Amendment, with our freedom of speech in this country. It's not an insurrection. And you know what? We know exactly what an insurrection is. We saw it on January 6th. And Trump, the leader of the insurrectionists, has pardoned those people. So it is just horrifying. But I think, like you said earlier, Nadine, I'm hoping that this, well, maybe you didn't say this, but you suggested this, I'm hoping that this overkill, this overreaction will really further alienate Trump from people who will see this as the manifestly unjust and lawless act that it is, and have that help further undermine him and his claims of a mandate. But what do you think, Nadine?
I'm thinking about all of those ranchers, all of those right-wingers, Posse Comitatus. Where are they now? Where's their outrage as it is actually unfolding? And it's sort of like the budget deficit. They don't give a damn about the deficit, except if they can use it to shred the pitiful safety net. And they're perfectly fine with U.S. military being brought in to point weapons at Americans, as long as it's the Americans they don't like. And so calling them hypocrites doesn't quite capture it, the level of cynicism. But I do think and hope that part of the storytelling that we do is about making people wake up to the fact that whatever you permit to happen to the least of these will come to visit you. You have to care about due process when they target people who are as far from you as you can imagine, precisely because you expand the boundary of who it can target. So, be motivated out of basic human decency, and if that fails, be motivated out of a sense of self-preservation. And I think that right now, that any city that is watching this uh, has to realize that it is a test run for what they intend to do across the country, and how we stand up in this moment matters as well. And I do think that the dancing and the peaceful gatherings and that sense of community, and we'll talk about that during our glass half full, but we're seeing more and more places where people are showing a tremendous amount of bravery in service to protecting their neighbors, and unlikely coalitions across party, across class, that are happening. It just, the fact that they're targeting reporters, quite literally, and specifically targeting reporters is always a terrifying thing, because we have to have the storytelling in order to shift public opinion. And so I think it can break either way, but there's a hope in me that, there's no science behind this, but growing up in the Panhandle, I've got a lot of high school friends who were, deep in Trump MAGA territory, and I don't see them defending this stuff online. I don't see them, rallying behind this online.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a like thin read implies that there's a read there, any basis for what they're doing. And I am reminded that, as you point out, like where, sort of where's the right, but maybe just sitting on the sidelines is a good place. Like just saying that they're not in favor of this, because it is just really unjustifiable, in reality, what Trump is doing. And in some ways it just reeks of desperation. Trump just comes off this bad break with Elon Musk. There's allegations by Musk about the Jeffrey Epstein files. It's ugly. There's threats going back and forth about SpaceX and contracts and more. And so, Trump needed a good distraction, change the conversation. And then you have the just repugnant Stephen Miller, who, apparently had some sort of rally the loyalists meeting in DC to say, like, you're not getting enough arrests. You're not doing enough, even though they've been harassing people and showing up at courthouses and arresting people who are coming in for their citizenship, test or more. It's outrageous. And the other person who seems pretty silent in this circumstance is good old Leonard Leo, who was also in the thick of a battle with Trump this past week. But I'm reminded, or at least I remember, that there was a very, famous leader in England who Leonard Leo has, presumably adored, Sir Thomas More. There's all these, tributes to Thomas More as a, Catholic and martyr in his own way. And, there's a famous scene in Robert Bolt's A Man for All Seasons about Sir Thomas More, who's been venerated by Leo and others. And in that exchange in this fictional book, but presumably has its own sort of lessons, William Roper says to Thomas More, "So now you would give the devil the benefit of the law?" And Sir Thomas More says, "Yes. What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil?" And Roper says, "Yes, I'd cut down every law in England to do that." And More says, "Oh, but when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, Roper? The laws all being flat. This country is planted thick with laws from coast to coast, man's laws, not God's. And if you cut them down and you are just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would then blow? Yeah, I'd give the devil the benefit of the law for my own safety's sake." I think that goes right to the point that both of you were making.
That's good.
So thank you for indulging me in a dramatic reading.
I like the dramatic reading. Yeah.
Well, yeah. My aside on that is, when I got to college, I love poetry. So I signed up for poetry interpretation. They didn't have a tryout. So I go to my first poetry interpretation competition and I read my poem, and the coach is there, and I come out and I go, "How did I do?" And he said, "Well, you debated the hell out of that poem." He said, I've got a place in the debate team for you, but you got to get off the poetry interpretation.
That was, but you know what? That was just that was a debate. So it worked beautifully. It worked beautifully.
Yes.
In fact, I think
Yes.
we might have to add a new segment where we act out our favorite scenes from classic movies.
Yes.
Speaking of classic movies, I think I heard they're making a new movie with Stephen Miller about all this. It's called Mad Max Beyond Santa Monica. I think it's going to be really good. I think, look out for it. Yeah.
Okay.
Rough and tumble Santa Monica.
Yes. Well,
timer has rung.
Oh, there you go. Well, this is great because you began to give us a nice transition to the next segment. But I will end that segment with this. There is, in terms of storytelling, there emerged some really beautiful footage, including a clip of Latino workers in a cafe tending to local sheriff's deputies who had gotten hit by a blast of tear gas, and they're pouring milk and fanning them and helping get them back together to safety. And I think at the end of the day, history tells us that in these moments where I think it was in Poland, in different places where dictators have been taken down, the people are talking to those people behind the riot gear, and they're reminding them, we're your daughters, we're your sons, we're your brothers, we're your neighbors, and tapping into a humanity that in the moment when it matters, we've seen it in history that they have taken a knee, they have refused to point their weapons, and I hold out hope that we will continue, those brave people in the streets will continue to evoke, draw the eyes of the nation and evoke some sense of decency and honor within those who Stephen Miller has set upon Los Angeles.
Hear, hear.
And hear, hear. So you spoke about Musk, and you talked about, how much of this is driven by the fact that, Donald Trump hated the taco comment. Trump always, what is it? Cops out? Oh, no.
Chickens out.
Chickens out. There we go. Trump always chickens out. How much of it has to do with Elon Musk calling him out? How much does it have to do with him stumbling up the stairs and looking, infirmed and weak? How much of all of this has to do with his very thin skin and his ego? And when you say thin skin and ego, you have to think of Elon Musk. And here we are with these two in a political food fight. Ever since Elon Musk got his, what is participation trophy? What did he get? Like a tacky spoon? I can't remember what it was.
It was a key, wasn't it?
The golden key. Golden key. Yes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we've had a week of them going back and forth, but today it seems Elon Musk has begun to backpedal, and some are suggesting that he has already, having burned up so much goodwill, that when people thought of him as the Tony Stark instead of the Nazi salute flashing, drug-addled egomaniac, and now he was, basically he was like, he's burning his bridges all over the place. There's no place left for him. And today it looked like he said uncle. He deleted his tweet that said plainly Trump is in the Epstein files, tantamount to saying Trump is not just a pedophile but a sex offender. And now he's pulling those down and issuing statements of regret for having said them at all. So was it that Trump threatened to yank down his Starlink contracts, or did they keep a backup file on all of those investigations that Elon Musk thought he had torpedoed through Doge? Why the change of heart?
Well, I mean, the one thing you said, he's burned bridges everywhere, but the one bridge he hasn't burned is the one that leads from Crimea back to Russia, because remember, Putin offered him amnesty and could go to Russia and stay there, and how wonderful that would be. But his father, Elon Musk, first of all, was on the record as saying, "Son, you done screwed up. What did you do? You better go back and make nice." And where was Elon Musk this week, you might ask? I will tell you, he was in Russia at the Alexander Dugin Tsar God, whatever the fuck it is, where he was, I don't know, sitting around talking about Nazi shit. So that's what Elon Musk was doing this very week, where he was, in the room with all these Putin fluffing thought leaders. And Elon has decided to come to Jesus, and by Jesus I mean Trump, which is not the same person. It's just
orange Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Dad goes to Moscow, and suddenly Elon puts his cap in his hand and goes back and begs forgiveness. All right, Lisa, what's your
Mako Taco?
Mako and Taco.
Mako Taco.
Yes.
Macho Taco. It can be macho.
And then Musk decides again on the let's change the page PR strategy. The news won't keep with us. We'll just create a new story. Musk says he's going to be deploying his driverless taxis in Austin. The end of one of the stories I read said, but no one knows who's monitoring the taxis. Like this lawless sort of deregulatory, going back to your Mountainhead reference at the beginning of, no rules. Like Musk is about to deploy driverless taxis in Austin, Texas. And it turns out, at least according to one of the main wire stories, no one knows who's actually monitoring them to make sure that they don't go awry and, hurt people. And meanwhile, there'd been like some dispute I was reading about between the Waymo taxis, which use LiDAR and this array of technology to try to make sure they know where everything is around them. I saw them when I was in Los Angeles last week. But that Musk doesn't want to use that technology because he wants to capture all the different kinds of data. I guess himself, he says it's not as good as the data he wants to create. So now we have this competing taxi, which Musk has been promising for literally years, coming in on almost a decade, being deployed suddenly just in this moment to try to buck up, the revenues and, projected profits for this company just in time to change the conversation from the conversation last week. I don't think it's a coincidence. And then the other thing I was going to say, which is slightly off topic, but since I'm a guest, I'm not constrained by the, host rules, although I clearly am not constrained by the host rules of being on topic. But if I haven't frozen yet, I'll just say one of the other disturbing stories I just read about the Starlink satellites, not just, the whole issue of Musk, threatening to cut off access to them, in Ukraine, and not just the very disturbing ties between his daddy-o and Putin, but also apparently this mass array of satellite transmitters of the internet is interfering with the ability of scientists around the world to have accurate data about our universe, because they're leaking so much of their own data into the atmosphere that they are impeding scientific work to better understand our solar system and the planet. And, why should we have that system when we could have municipal broadband? We could have free local broadband like Longmont, Colorado has, what the big telecom companies have tried to squash. Or we could have this billionaire controlling this mass of satellites and then threatening to cut them off whenever it's his whim. I guess if you're in some sort of warlike scenario, if you're not on his side. And meanwhile, these things have other unintended consequences, meaning affecting our actual ability to have instruments accurately record what's happening in the universe, because the Starlink satellites are interfering to some extent, and probably a growing extent as his field of dominance grows as a result of the Trump administration's effort to squeeze countries in Africa and elsewhere to enter into contracts with none other than Elon Musk.
It's interesting you bring up the study of the solar system and the galaxy, because like these things are studying black holes, but the only thing that sucks harder than a black hole is Elon Musk. And now we know this. It's been proven. Put a thing in it. Who's taking an Elon Musk taxi? Who in Austin, Texas is going to get if I'm going to get a taxi without, I don't even like, if I'm in New York City, I don't even like taking Uber. I like to have a yellow cab with a medallion there that was paid for by giving a percentage to the mob, just like in old times. That's how it should be, I say.
All right.
No, but seriously, who's getting in this thing?
Yeah. Oh, is that the end of our?
Yeah.
They're getting
Nadine,
in.
I feel like you didn't say anything.
For that one.
Nadine, I don't think you said anything. I want to hear what you have to say.
Yes.
Didn't I?
Yes.
Didn't I?
I don't know. I feel like you didn't.
Oh, about Elon? No, I said the table. Yeah, I set the table, but I did note that Waymo unmanned, unpersoned taxis were being set on fire, and Waymo was talking about pulling out of a certain city because people were, setting them on fire and walking away. I think that the Tesla taxis have the advantage of setting themselves on fire. So, so I think there's there you go.
Nice.
I will cancel an Uber if it's a Tesla. So I'm not in their marketplace. But it reminds me of the Tesla protest where MAGA was coming to defend Tesla from protesters, and they all show up in like Fords and Dodges, not a Tesla among them, and just a bunch of big trucks with metallic scrotums attached to the bumper. So speaking of which, I can't even make this be a segue, but there is a new Pew survey out that shows that global trust in Donald Trump is collapsing. It shows global confidence in Trump has dropped double digits in nearly every region. NATO allies do not trust America. Trade partners are distancing themselves, finding alternative routes. And even places like Hungary and Brazil are beginning to hedge their bets. And the world, sees what we see, an unstable figure obsessed with his ego and completely unpredictable. So, the strongman act is beginning to fail, and that was not just because he's slipping on stairs and getting into cat fights with Elon, but if the globe is turning on him, what does that mean for domestic? Do Americans care? Or do we? What do you make of that? What do you make of how that plays out inside the U.S.?
I think most people in the United States don't give a shit about any other country at all. I think a significant number of the United States couldn't find France on a map, and that's the most popular country I could think of. Maybe Italy because it's boot shaped, maybe. And I don't think it has.
Don't they?
It has no bearing on anything other than, if the tariffs and this stuff, and people have to pay more for Walmart stuff, that might, get in there. But I think that the level of sophistication that you need to have in your thinking to understand, for example, why USAID is important and why soft power was important and why NATO is important and financing NATO is important. I think most Americans, or too many, I shouldn't say most, I should say too many Americans just don't have either the imagination or the patience to understand why that would be a thing. And I think if other countries don't like us, they will be like, good, this is great, Trump, yeah, USA, we don't need you, or something. That's what I think.
Did we go to high school together? Seems so familiar to me. What about you, Lisa?
Well,
what does it
I do agree with Greg that there is sort of a certain amount of ignorance and antipathy by some portion of Americans, some of whom do travel abroad and get reputations as ugly Americans for how they treat other people or are upset that other people don't speak their language. But I also think, this realignment that's happening because of Trump's just utter stupidity and contemptuousness for the international system that has created a lot of stability in the world, not complete stability. There's certainly been, I mean, the 20th century was a century of war. And, you know, here we are a quarter way through the 21st century, and there are, you know, numerous significant atrocities that have been committed that our international regime has not contained. And in fact, you had Donald Trump just in the past week or so assail the judges at the International Criminal Court, the Court of Criminal Justice for the world, like the world court that polices crimes against humanity and human rights abuses. And you had Trump attacking 4 of the justices on that court, or assailing them for daring to try to hold Benjamin Netanyahu accountable in international court for his actions. You also had the Israeli Supreme Court for many months that was trying to hold Benjamin Netanyahu accountable for other reasons, and many protests in Tel Aviv about Netanyahu's the alleged criminal activities of Netanyahu before the crisis in Gaza. And so now what we're seeing on a broader scale is, first of all, you have this total hostility of Trump toward international agreements, international institutions. And it's true that many American people don't even understand what those institutions are or that they exist. But some of those institutions Americans do know about, and they have helped keep the peace in certain parts of the world or help protect our security, like NATO. And the last sort of US entity that was super hostile to NATO was the John Birch Society, which was a totally discredited, ridiculous, operation. This saw communism in the Supreme Court, and even in President Eisenhower, the former Allied commander. That group that was co-founded by Fred Koch, Charles Koch's dad, that group that was funded by Fred Koch and Charles Koch. We have the documents to prove it. I unearthed those to show that Charles Koch was funding the Birchers in the 1960s as they attacked the United Nations, the US Supreme Court, and also Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. They were assailing the civil rights community and civil rights efforts to secure voting rights. That John Birch Society that was sort of laughed out of the room for asserting that the president was a communist. That's the group that really tried to take on the United Nations and NATO as supposedly bad ideas. But NATO has been a significant force for Europe and the US because of Russian ambitions for more domination. And as Greg has written extensively about in, I think, a couple books, at least one of which I read, the most recent one, has really documented this, how Putin, Russia is post-communist in the sense that it's now, a autocracy, but it's not post-communist in the sense of Putin as a longtime communist who wants Russia to be seen as the dominant power in the world that it once was, and whose dominance is tied directly to trying to weaken and destabilize the United States. And if you were to map out, as Greg I think has done in different forms in both the newsletter and the books, if you were to map out what are Putin's goals for America internationally, Trump's following the playbook to a T. It's like weaken our alliances, destroy our closest allies, those relationships. Weaken NATO so that we're not funding it, so that he has free reign to sort of decide what part of Eastern Europe he wants to reclaim for the glory days of the old Soviet Union. Weaken the U.S. in terms of its international peace and humanitarian mission in countries in Africa and around the world. I mean, Trump is following that playbook as if he is a Russian stooge. Greg, what do you think about that?
It doesn't even matter what it's what he's doing. He's been doing it since 1980 something, and he's never wavered from it. I mean, and I keep saying this, but since NATO was founded in 1949, okay, we've had no major wars in Europe. I know there's been things in the Balkans and little things here and there, but there hasn't been a major war in Europe since 1949. The longest time, or the last time we had this long peace in that much of Europe was in the reign of Antonius Pius in the 2nd century AD. It is such a historical anomaly to have peace, to have France and Germany not fighting each other, to have France and England not fighting each other, to have Livonia and Russia not fighting each other or whatever. And it doesn't happen. And the reason, well, there's two. One, NATO. Two, America will kick your ass. Those are the two reasons. And everything else falls in the wayside. And Trump is basically single-handedly destroying both of those things. Now, where might this lead, I wonder? I don't know. It's not good.
Well, yeah. I agree that most Americans, or too many Americans, won't care that America's reputation globally is plummeting. For the same reason people don't take climate change seriously. The steady erosion of the thing doesn't clock until we reach that slowly and then suddenly all at once moment. But I do think where Americans do experience this and do respond to it has everything to do with tourism and travel. And we are seeing double-digit, declines in people coming to the U.S. because you have, two backpacking British college students, being thrown in ICE jail because they didn't book a hotel for their backpacking trip. Or you have, Canadians, which I think those numbers are down 40% of Canadian, of the travel from Canada to the U.S. For all of the same reasons. Canadians selling their homes in Florida and Arizona and different places because they feel it's quite credible that Trump will seize Canadian property as a prelude to invasion. I mean, like, all of these things sound absurd to say out loud, but we are experiencing it, and there is a brain drain that is happening. You close the door to international students. Part of the reason that America is the superpower that it is because it benefited from the brain drain of other countries fleeing the Nazis. And now other countries are happy to take the best and brightest from the U.S., where they are upholding principles of democracy and inclusion and all of these things that Trump has turned on. So I do think when it begins to hit people in the pocketbook, and there's a lot of people who don't realize it's not that you have to run a hotel or be a Disney World for you to be impacted by the tourism that is not coming to the U.S. There's a whole trail of people who will be out of business because the visitors aren't coming. Your cafe is not going to be full. The services that you provide. So I think we're going to see some of that. And then there's just the ugly American, during the Bush wars, Bush 1 wars, traveling abroad, if you were an American, you were aware that people did not support what the U.S. was doing. So I think it has some impact, but not. And I think the business community is possibly the place where their silence will begin to, once he starts playing favorites, there's no longer a thing that you will lose by not standing up.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of standing up, I think now would be a great time to go to our segment that we call the Glass Half Full. Before we go, we end always with the glass half full, not to ignore what's broken, but to remind ourselves of what is still beautiful, still bold, and still possible. And so today, I want to draw everyone's attention to these moments of good people standing up. In Montana, where parents, formed a circle to protect a mom from being arrested. In Tennessee, a factory owner shut down operations after ICE detained their workers. In New Jersey, churches moved a family through an underground network. In Echo Park, neighbors used their cars to block an ICE van. And in Los Angeles, we see people continuing to take to the streets. And in the aftermath of SEIU union leader David Huerta's arrest during a peaceful protest, they have worked very hard to intimidate him but it appears that it is backfiring. His arrest has actually galvanized the labor movement. Unions all across the country have condemned it as a direct attack on working families. And these moments, they remind us that that community still matters, that conscience still matters, that we still have a choice in these moments. And so to all of the people taking to the streets, raising their voices, and refusing to be intimidated, we toast you. I think next week I'm just going to have a shot glass. I think a shot glass is the right way.
I think that's a great idea.
Well, I am Nadine Smith alongside Greg Olear and Lisa Graves. Thanks for making space for the 5-8.5, your midweek breather. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Be sure to tune in Friday for the 5-8 with Greg Olear and LB. And we will see you here on Wednesday at 8 o'clock Eastern. Don't forget to subscribe. Good night.